Tonight you've come to be trained as a Jew, then. You want to become more Jewish. The message last Friday night on Judaism, the crown of ITP studies, that was packed with a lot of information. Be sure that you try to hear that again. I dropped a lot of hints at, I gave you an outline of where we're going, so that wasn't a hint, that was very obvious, but some hints at some controversial questions that are important for New Testament studies. The business of Hellenism versus Hebraism and so forth. Different things that I listened to it myself, and more was said than I realized. So maybe you want to, whenever you obtain that message, try to hear it at least one time and try to become familiar. If you're familiar with that, you're familiar with the whole outline of our study now for the next few years, I think, as I said last time. Now, one of the brothers came up to me just a while back since then and said that, well, all you teach around here are introductory studies. Everything we do is an introductory study. And I said, well, at least no one will ever hold me responsible for knowing anything, then, will they? Because all I've done is introduce the subject. So I said, that's one reason I do that. No one can hold me responsible for knowing anything. All I did was just got the wheels turning. Well, this will be kind of an introductory study, I guess. There's a lot more you could say about it, but I think we'll say everything that's really important for you to know so that we can study New Testament issues. Now, in the first place tonight, we've got quite a lot of material to look at just regarding the Greek term itself, which is what we're going to be setting into and setting our sights on tonight. And it will be a study in itself this evening before we can move on to discuss the features of the diaspora and how it relates to ITP. By the way, this is page 5 on the outline. We'll go according to those. I think I gave you 9 divisions of our study. We'll go according to those 9 divisions that I gave you last Friday night. Top of page 5, Judaism. Number 1 was just kind of supposed to be last week, I guess. Changes which occurred during the intertestamental period. We didn't really go into specific changes that occurred in the period between the Testaments, but that set the scene, because I did make statements such as, well, when you open the New Testament, why is it that the Jewish form of religion that you come across immediately in the early chapters of Matthew's Gospel, or if you think Mark was written first in Mark's Gospel, is so different than what you find in the pages of the Old Testament? The Old Testament contains the Jewish expression of religion then, and why it's so different now. You could even go from the time of Moses to the time of the post-exilic prophets, and you've gone 1,000 years in history, and you find a form of Jewish religion that's still very, very similar. It stays essentially the same without a lot of change from the time of Moses down to the post-exilic prophets. But you go through that period of the so-called 400 silent years, and you open the New Testament and things have changed. And then number 2, examples of this change. That one doesn't want to learn to be a Jew tonight. Examples of these changes in Judaism. Now the first one, diaspora. That's where we're going to start tonight. And I probably have 25 to 30 messages here on the diaspora. Meaning of the term, conquerors of Palestine, Assyria, Babylon, Greece. And what are you laughing for out there? The New Testament appearances. That's vintage Chino Ross, I guess, if I've got 30 messages on the diaspora. Now, it's going to be a little technical in some of the areas, but I missed whatever that was. But it's going to be very interesting. I have just had a spiritual field day in this whole study, and I never would have thought years ago it would be such a delight to study something as dry as the diaspora. But lest you be too bored with our review of the term tonight, which would just be that word under B2A, small a, lest you be too bored with that, I might warn you that that term has become a technical term in Judaism, and it's been used for the last 2,000 years, and it is still in use today. So it would be good to know something about it. In other words, this doesn't mean, in studying the term diaspora, that it's only going to help us for the 400 years between the Testaments. The term became a technical term in Judaism by the first century of early Christianity. It certainly is a technical term, and I think earlier than that it has been established as a technical term And it stays that way for over 2,000 years, and it's still a technical term today. Let's start with the Greek term itself. You already have it spelled for you on your outline. So there's the English, and there you have the Greek. Greek, you got 4 syllables here. Diaspora. The Greek accent falls on the last syllable. We're going to give it its English pronunciation. The English accent falls here, diaspora. The Greek, it's diaspora, and you raise your voice and you accent the last syllable. D-I-A-S-P-O-R-A. Diaspora, the Greek, diaspora, the English. Or you could have an E instead of an I. Diaspora, diaspora, dia, short I, but I think you'll generally find it as a long I. So if you've never heard that term, probably you have around here, but if you haven't heard that term, you'll be introduced to it tonight. And if you have, you'll find a lot more out about it tonight in the weeks that follow as well. But it's a term you need to be familiar with right away, the diaspora. It's a technical term, the diaspora. Here's the definition. The diaspora of the Jews. For the diaspora of the Jews, here's the definition. And so this is what we'll be looking at for the next 30 weeks or so. The scattering of the Jews during any time in history to Gentile-occupied territories beyond the confines of Palestine. Each segment of the definition is significant. The scattering of the Jews. Now, this is the diaspora of the Jews. The term is specifically a Jewish term, but it could be used for any people, any religion. The scattering of the Jews during any time in history. This isn't just something that took place in AD 70 or 586 BC or a German Jewish diaspora in the Second World War in Nazi Germany. During any time in history. To Gentile-occupied territories. So that if the Jews go and then come back, then they're not a part of the diaspora. Not in place anyway, not in location, because they're back in their home territory. To Gentile-occupied territories beyond the confines of Palestine. And you may well have already known, essentially, you might not have been able to write as concise and clear a definition as that, but I'm sure you had some idea of what the diaspora was. It's a scattering of the Jewish people. So, what does the word mean? We happen to have an English word, and it just happens to work out this way. By the way, you've noticed here that we haven't done anything in going from Greek to English. We simply gave you a strict transliteration, and this has now become, we think of this as an English term. I mean, it's just used in English all the time. But it's a Greek term. The accent's been moved back 2 syllables earlier, but it's spelled exactly the same. Nothing changes at all. We're fortunate enough, if someone sees that term, I remember, well, I don't remember the first time I came across that, but I remember in much earlier years of my study coming across that term, and I didn't know what that was. I don't know if it was something to do with seeds, spores, diaspora, something to do with seeds or vegetation. I had no idea what it was. Saw that diaspora, and that's the way I thought you should pronounce it. But we just are fortunate enough to happen to have an English term that looks similar, that happens to be synonymous with that. So if you don't remember scattering, you can remember dispersion. Dispersion is a good English term that is more or less a synonym for the diaspora. So we either have dispersion or scattering. You'll probably end up seeing both of those. I'll just do this while you're writing to prepare for later. You don't need to write that yet. That'll be for later, though. It's only found one time, diaspora, outside of Jewish or Christian writings, which shows just how technical of a term. It wasn't just a common Greek term that everyone used, a secular, profane Greek term. It's found only once outside of Jewish or Christian writing, or Jewish Christian writing. And that's in Plutarch, Plutarch. Plutarch, which is not an important reference. The scattering of the Jews during any time in history to Gentile-occupied territories beyond the confines of Palestine. Let's start with the usage in the Septuagint, which is what I want to concentrate on tonight. Now, it is a Greek term, so you will not find it in the Hebrew Jewish Old Testament. It's a Greek term. Now, whether there's an appropriate Hebrew synonym is another matter. We'll get to that later whenever we get down to what I have on the bottom right-hand corner of our board. But we can go back to the Hebrew Old Testament. We could start with the New, because the New was written in Greek, and this is a Greek term, and we could try to find references in the New Testament to diaspora. But we have an important body of literature that comes earlier than the documents of the New Testament era, and those would be those documents that comprise the LXX, the Septuagint, written in Greek, a transliteration in Greek of the Hebrew Old Testament. Yes, it does appear in the Septuagint 12 times. We're going to look at all 12 references. And it always appears as a technical term for the Jewish dispersion. Now, the Septuagint, we would just approximately, and rounding it off, date the 2nd century BC. The 2nd century BC. So it would be very easy to argue, there would be no disputing this fact, that by the 2nd century BC, this Greek term, diaspora, has become a technical term in Judaism. Now, the Jewish people didn't speak Greek that many years prior to this, so we can't really go much earlier and say, now, how early can we go in finding diaspora as a technical Greek term? We have to come after the time of the conquest of Alexander the Great, in the very end, the last quarter of the 4th century BC, before we could even have the hope of finding Jewish people who would speak the Greek language somewhere outside of Greece. If there might have been a few Jews living in Greece, maybe they spoke Greek there. But we'd have to come quite a bit after that time to find Greek as a regular language of people in the Levant. 12 times, always as a technical term for the Jewish dispersion among the Gentiles, especially in reference to the Babylonian captivity. See, we're going to do a study of this tonight, and so we acquaint ourselves with the dispersion, with the term diaspora or diaspora. And so we know what the Jews of the 2nd century BC, and these are Egyptian Jews of the 2nd century BC, and that's going to add a slight difference, a different slant, than if we had Jerusalem, Judean, even Galilean Jews of the 2nd century BC. We're talking about the Jews living in Alexandria, which is the city of residence where the LXX was translated. Now, let's go through these 12 passages then. We'll use, I guess, the NIV, but I'll make reference to the KJV sometimes as well. As a matter of fact, maybe we need to start with both of those. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, maybe we need to start with both of these because we have an entirely different reading when you contrast the NIV's Deuteronomy 28:25 with that in the King James Version. Deuteronomy 28 is that monumental chapter of covenant blessings and curses, the stipulations of the covenant of the Jews. If you obey, hearken to my words, do my will, then all these blessings will come on you and overtake you. And if you don't, then more of the chapter than for the blessings is devoted to the curses that will come. And so we jump down into verse 25, the NIV. The Lord will cause you to be defeated before your enemies. Remember, though, what we have here in the NIV, for the most part anyway, and in the KJV, for the most part, maybe a little less so in some of these passages than the NIV, is a translation from the Hebrew Old Testament and not from the Septuagint, not from the LXX. The Lord will cause you to be defeated before your enemies. You will come at them from one direction, but flee from them in 7, and you will become a thing of horror to all the kingdoms on earth. Well, I didn't see anything about dispersion in there, or diaspora. I didn't find that term. We're not looking for general vague references. We're looking for an actual appearance, an actual occurrence of the term, diaspora. Now, in LXX, though, not in the Masoretic text. Now, the King James Version ends this verse as follows. Thou shalt be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. Now, thou shalt be removed into the kingdoms of the earth, rather than you will become a thing of horror to the kingdoms of the earth. It's something quite a bit different. The KJV certainly has the diaspora notion spelled out very clearly there. Thou shalt be removed, scattered, dispersed into all the kingdoms of the earth. Well, the Hebrew word here, it's a different Hebrew word that's found in many of the other biblical places that we'll look at, means unsettlement or ill usage, object of terror, or thing of horror. It's a broad word, so it can mean different things, and the context will determine how you would interpret. Unsettlement or ill usage, or an object of terror, or, as the NIV has, a thing of horror. So in the Hebrew Old Testament, in Deuteronomy 28:25, there really is no reference by a specific term. Let me clarify that. No reference by a specific, technical Hebrew term here to the Jewish dispersion or the diaspora. Now, that's not true in the LXX. In the LXX, you have diaspora. You actually have the Greek term right here, which is very similar to the KJV. So the KJV translators may have depended more on the LXX for their rendition of the last half of Deuteronomy 28:25 rather than the Masoretic Hebrew text of the Old Testament. KJV again, if you don't have yours open, thou shalt be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. But of course there's nothing just terribly wrong with the King James Version's translation, because it definitely represents the dispersion idea, and I think this is germane to the context here. Remember, Deuteronomy 28 is about the curses, that if you obey me, you'll be blessed, but then if you disobey me, rather than having a productive land and bountiful crops and plenty of oil and wine, then you'll be cursed and you'll be scattered throughout all the world. So although you might not find it so specifically with the technical term here in this verse, I think the idea of dispersion is germane to the curses verses found here in Deuteronomy chapter 28. But the NIV, if you want to know what's better according to the Hebrew, the NIV is a better rendering. But remember, the Masoretic text is not always 100% reliable. Sometimes the Septuagint actually preserves a textual tradition that goes back earlier than the Masoretic text. But I don't think that needs to be argued here one way or the other. Because let's keep it NIV, you will become a thing of horror to all kingdoms on the earth. Well, you could get the implication there that if you're going to be a thing of horror to all the kingdoms of the earth, you must be scattered in those kingdoms of the earth, or you couldn't be a thing of horror to them. And a thing of horror would mean they would look upon you and realize that you had forsaken your God, and that's why your God has taken you out of your homeland and scattered you all over the world. And therefore you would, in essence, become a thing of horror or an object of terror to all the kingdoms of the world. So there is one passage. Then a second one, same book, chapter 30 and verse 4. Chapter 30 and verse 4. Remember, all we're doing right now is looking at the appearance of this term in the Septuagint. That's all we're doing. Now maybe the idea, maybe the prediction by Moses or an earlier prophet, but let's just stay with Moses since he wrote Deuteronomy. Maybe a prediction by Moses of the Jewish dispersion actually antedates these passages, Deuteronomy 28 and chapter 30 as well. But we're not going to find the specific Greek term there in the LXX, and so that's why we're not looking at it right now. When all these blessings and curses I have set before you come upon you, and you take them to heart wherever the Lord your God disperses you among the nations. Now, we haven't gotten there yet, although I just saw a good word there. We're still not there yet. And when you and your children return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart, with all your soul, according to everything I command you today, and the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations where he scattered you. Now the LXX has diaspora in verse 4, The NIV has scatter, and I'm sure the King James has something that's comparable to that. But not for the disperses back earlier in verse 1. So we're going to find many things that just don't seem to be in sync with one another when we go from our English Bible, and most of it's been taken from the Hebrew text, and jump over to the Septuagint. So Deuteronomy 34, chapter 30, verse 4 would be a second reference. Number 3, Nehemiah 1:9. We're going to make comments on what we have gained from our review of all of these places whenever we complete the 12th one. Nehemiah 1:9. Well, I really need to skip them to verse 8, I guess, as well. If you're unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But no dispersion there in the Septuagint. But if you return to me and obey my commands, even then, if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place where I've chosen as a dwelling for my name. Exile people. So you have some type of dispersion on your hands there. What, that's 1, 2, 3, a fourth reference. Psalm 138, you don't need to turn there because your Bible won't have anything, but some manuscripts of the Septuagint have diaspora in the title of Psalm 138. I doubt you'll find it in either your KJV or NIV. But some stray LXX manuscripts have diaspora in the title of Psalm 138. Just of David, a Psalm of David, but they'll have the dispersion thrown in. And then you can turn here, same book, chapter 147 and verse 2. Psalm 147 and verse 2. The Lord builds up Jerusalem. He gathers the exiles of Israel. The Lord builds up Jerusalem. He gathers the exiles of Israel. You see, there are probably, well, I would hate to even take a pot shot at guessing how many verses there are in the Old Testament that speak of the Jewish diaspora. A prediction of it in the future, and maybe psalms such as Psalm 147, if it's a post-exilic psalm, you know, a psalm that has already, the author writing the psalm has already gone through as a representative of the corporate body of Israel, the dispersion experience, and so he's looking back on it. He knows that God is going to be faithful to covenant promises such as those in the Deuteronomic law that were given by Moses centuries earlier. But don't, as we run through here, overlook what the verses say, the significance of them. There are just hundreds and hundreds of verses in the Old Testament that predict, as early as Deuteronomy 4, that predict Israel's disobedience and then predict on the basis of that Israel's dispersion among the nations. God would never scatter a people that was obedient to him, that maintained covenant faithfulness and a spiritual relationship in right standing before him. He would never scatter them. But he'll scatter the Jews that disobey him. So you kind of have disobedience equals diaspora. And you find hundreds of references to that. Here's one that goes one step past that, though. There are many that predict their dispersion, and then either in that context or later, and maybe you have to go to a different book or another author, then the next place will say, and not only will he scatter, but he'll also restore. Those that disobeyed, that he scattered, he will restore at the right time. The Lord builds up Jerusalem and gathers the exiles of Israel. Probably you have a post-exilic psalm here. I haven't checked it out, so don't quote me on that, but I'm assuming just from reading the second verse, you have a post-exilic psalm, or why would you have something like this set? Not all the psalms are written by David way back in the 11th century B.C. now. Some of them are very late. This book of Psalms is Sefer Tehillim, the book of praises, is a composite work of many different authors over hundreds and hundreds of years, probably over a half millennium. And then we have an Ezra, the paradigmatic scribe, or someone who comes on the scene later and puts all of the Psalms together. Isaiah chapter 49 and verse 6. Slow me down if I go too fast, but I don't think I am. It's fairly easy just to jot the verses down and quickly flip over to them. Isaiah chapter 49 and verse 6. Now this is one of the servant songs in the book. It's what they're technically called, although songs sometimes might not be a good term. It's certainly one of the servant sections of so-called Deutero-Isaiah. He says, "It is too small a thing for you to be my servant, to restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back those of Israel I have kept." Bring back those of Israel I have kept. Now, the KJV has something similar to that, but then it has a marginal reference there toward the end. "For those of Israel I have kept." The marginal reference reads, "desolations." Desolations, which is an interesting marginal reading in Isaiah 49:6. The preserved of Israel, I think the KJV would read something like that, "are those that I have kept." Again, you might be looking at this and saying, "I'm not seeing very many dispersion references here." Well, we'll get to that, why we have that problem here in a moment. I mean, the preserved of Israel doesn't necessarily say anything about exiles or about the dispersion. It could, and you preserve them in that. But of course, you could have preserved them back in their homeland as well. Jeremiah chapter 13 and verse 14. "Will smash them one against the other, fathers and sons alike, declares the Lord. I will allow no pity or mercy or compassion to keep me from destroying them." To keep me from destroying them. LXX for destroying them, you'll have diaspora dispersion. Jeremiah 15:7, you'll have winnow or fan, like you winnow the grain, W-I-N-N-O-W. Winnow or fan, 15:7. Jeremiah 41:17. You may want to see this because this is just totally out of the context for any technical appearance of the term diaspora. Jeremiah 41:17. "And they went on," stopping it in various places on their way to Egypt. They're disobeying the Lord. You remember the people who have remained in Jerusalem after the fall of the city, and they're going to go down to Egypt now and try to protect themselves from Nebuchadnezzar. And they even compel, it appears, it's not said, but we would take it as them compelling Jeremiah and his scribe Baruch to go with them to Egypt. And then later Jeremiah predicts very specifically that the very place where Israel has set up some of their tents and dwelling places, Nebuchadnezzar will come there. And the very stones they've walked past, the Pharaoh's house, he will come and spread his tent there. In other words, speaking of the Babylonian invasion of Egypt, which happens a few years after this. And so it's an exile for the people who are in exile, a double exile. Well, you've got this first phrase, "and they went on," or the KJV, "they departed." In the LXX, you have diaspora for went on or departed. You know, like departed into exile. They went on into Egypt. So it was a dispersion. It was a diaspora. Then in Daniel 12 and verse 2, he's living around the same time as Jeremiah, but chapter 12 of his book would be way at the end of his life. And remember, he's there in Babylonian exile for many, many years. Maybe 70 years he's there. Because he seems to go over very early, and he seems to be the one praying in chapter 9 after he studied the books and the prophecies of Jeremiah, then Lord restore the people back, and it would take 70 years for God to fulfill that prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 25. Last chapter, we'll start with verse 1, but it's in verse 2. "At that time Michael, the great prince, who protects your people, will arise. There shall be a time of distress such as has not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Behind the word shame in the LXX, you have diaspora. Behind the term shame, you have diaspora. Now, what is that? 10 I've given you already? Okay, 2 more. Those are Old Testament canonical texts, but the LXX, the later manuscripts anyway, contain the Apocrypha. So Numbers 11 and 12 are from the Apocrypha. Number 11, Judith chapter 5 and verse 19. Holofernes, who is the Assyrian commander, wants to take Israel. Israel has been pestering him, and he wants to capture the people and do a lot of slaughter in their land. And so he summons some of the rulers of Moab and some of the commanders of the Ammonite forces to him and asks their opinion. And one of the Ammonite military leaders, Achior, gives him a beautiful history. And you probably won't remember this, but it's on tape and it's in your notes for Judith 5. Gives him a beautiful history of the nation of Israel. That he even calls them descendants of the Chaldeans, speaking of Abram being called out of Ur of the Chaldees. And he goes through the history of them going down into Egypt, and then God dried up the Red Sea and dried up the Jordan River and brought them over into Palestine and gave them a very beautiful country and land, and he fought their battles for them until they forsook him and began to worship the gods of the other nations. And then he sold them into captivity. Jumping down to verse 19, the New English Bible's translation of the Apocrypha. But now they that have returned to their God, they have come back from the places where they had been dispersed and have. So one gives you dispersed, dispersion, and one gives you scattered. And then in 2 Maccabees 1:27. 2 Maccabees starts off with several letters written from the Jews in Jerusalem to the Jews down in Egypt, recommending that they observe a certain festival with sacrifice. And so I'll just give you one little excerpt. 2 Maccabees 1:27, it's a prayer that they're praying. Gather those that are scattered from us. Gather those that are scattered from us. And of course, behind the word scattered is this technical Greek term, diaspora. Okay, there are the 12 references. Now you say, what's the big deal about that? Well, let's make some points on our review of this diaspora term in the LXX. And I've got a whole fistful of these. Number 1, so here's some reflections, you could say. Reflections on the technical term diaspora. Reflections on the technical term diaspora, which is really what you want to understand tonight. Number 1, the English translations many times do not carry any idea of a dispersion. KJV or NIV. The English translations many times do not carry any idea of a dispersion. When the LXX is using diaspora. And did you notice that already? Remember the Daniel 12:2? Some that would be raised to life would be raised to shame, and some to everlasting life. Well, what does shame have to do with dispersion? Nothing at all, either in the NIV or the KJV. So the English translations frequently do not carry any idea of a dispersion whenever the Septuagint is using the technical term, diaspora. Why is that? Well, here's our second reflection, our second point of reflection. That's because different Hebrew words are actually behind the Greek LXX and its use of diaspora. Now I'm saying two things here. Maybe I need to clarify this. I'll say that again, then I'll say what I'm saying. That's because different Hebrew words are behind the Greek LXX use of diaspora. Now, first of all, what I'm saying is we don't have a precise technical term. And I'll get to that, and I'll clarify that here in just a moment. behind these appearances of diaspora and the LXX. And then secondly, what I'm really pointing out right here is that we don't just have one single term, whether it's a technical or non-technical. We don't have one single term that's found uniformly in all 12 of these places in the Hebrew text where diaspora occurs in the LXX. For instance, I started off with Deuteronomy 28:25 and Deuteronomy 30 and verse 4. In both of those verses, diaspora is found in the Septuagint. But the Hebrew word that it translates is different in both cases. So even though we're not talking about a specific technical term, we're not talking about any one single term that's found uniformly from number 1, Deuteronomy 28:25 to number 12, 2 Maccabees 1:27. And the best place to prove that are the two places within a couple of chapters of one another, Deuteronomy chapters 28 and 30. A third point of reflection, which I just hinted at there, there's no single technical Hebrew term that matches the Greek diaspora. There are two Hebrew terms that are somewhat close to it, but somewhat far away at the same time. So this is number 3, there's no single technical Hebrew term that matches diaspora. But we do have two Hebrew words that appear in some of these places, and sometimes neither one of these appear. We have galut and golah. See if I can transliterate. That's Hebrew for you over there. They're fairly easy to remember. And this second one, golah, is really the important one. Galut and golah. G-A-L-U-T G-O-L-A-H. They're pretty much synonyms. Galut and golah are pretty much synonyms in Hebrew. They mean such things as leading away, exile, deportation. Galut, golah. I didn't have enough room over there to write the Hebrew very well, but I assume that you can read the Hebrew well enough. Now, in other words, what I'm trying to argue is this, and this, to me, this is significant anyway. Maybe I need to go into explaining why I want to spend some time here. Now, we've got this term that is a technical term as far as the Jews in Alexandria, Egypt are concerned. By the 2nd century BC, they're using this term to refer to just one thing, and that is this definition of the Jewish dispersion that I've given you. But we don't have anything in Hebrew. Now, we could argue, well, whenever we're using the Hebrew language, we're back in times that precede Babylonian captivity, and so we don't have any dispersion to be talking about. Well, for the most part, that's true. That is, that we're antedating the Babylonian captivity with most of the books of the Old Testament. That's not true with the post-exilic prophets, though. They could use that term. But moreover, the earlier books that do antedate the Babylonian captivity, such as Deuteronomy, still look into the future and predict this dispersion. And so they still could have used, if they wanted to, if they had one, a technical term to refer to the dispersion. But they didn't have one. These two terms are the closest things that we can get to this dispersion, this diaspora in Greek. Sometimes these words are found in some of these places, Numbers 1 to 12 that I gave you, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes you just have something entirely different, such as shame. I mean, shame in Daniel 12:2, you're not going to have galut or golah there. You'll have something that's entirely different than that. So we're talking about non-technical terms that are found in Hebrew. Now, if this means, and this is true for this word as well, if diaspora means, let's stay with D so it's easy to remember, dispersion. What's the D term that galut and golah mean? Deportation. We'll stay with D so it's easy to remember. Now here's something that I find significant. Do you see any difference between those two words? Are they synonyms or are they the same? Dispersion. What does dispersion mean? The Jews are scattered. All right. What did the scattering? If all you have is just this term, you don't have anything else. You don't have anything. No, there's no context. You don't know any history of Israel. You just have diaspora. You know that it means dispersion. Then you'd have to answer, well, I don't know. I don't know why they were dispersed, what caused the dispersion. I know they're dispersed. The only thing you'll know from this term, if that's all you have, is that these people, the Jews, are not in Palestine anymore. I don't know what caused them to be outside. I don't know when it happened. I don't know why it happened. I don't know if it's going to ever be reversed or changed. All I know is that they're dispersed. Maybe they just ran out of a good, lucrative business in Palestine and decided to move somewhere else, and so they were scattered. Oh, what's this term mean then? All right, we've got foreign invaders here then. We've got Gentile conquerors that have come in and deported the people. You know what an import is. A deport is just the reverse. Deported the people outside of the country. So let's come to our fourth point then. Now that's probably the most significant thing we'll say tonight is just what I've been explaining about what the Hebrew terms mean and what the Greek term means. In other words, before I get to, well, you can mark this as your fourth point, I guess. This seems to be an easy term, or let's say the easier of the two. This is rather harsh, or hard, soft. Because scattering, maybe you just decided you just outgrew your parents' bondage of their home, and you wanted to move to Rome, and so you just scattered yourself. You were dispersed. That's a soft term, softer, easier. Deportation. I see visions in my mind of ranks of soldiers and cavalry and shields and bulwarks and battering rams. I see war behind a term like deportation. So we might ask this question then, why the relatively easy Greek term, dispersion, for the more specifically painful Hebrew term, deportation? In other words, in places like Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 4, when it speaks of those dispersed, really what we're talking about is those who are exiled. Not just dispersed or scattered, those who are exiled. And sometimes you'll find exile as the translation. Why the relatively easy Greek term, diaspora? This is 2nd century BC, so this comes after this, post-dates the Hebrew Old Testament. Why the relatively soft, easy Greek term for the more specifically painful Hebrew term of galut or golah or deportation? This latter one, I think very notably, carries with it the idea of force, of military force and conquest, and therefore a deportation of the people as exiled slaves to a foreign master. The earlier term, diaspora, does not necessarily carry any idea of force or military conquest. Now it could. That could have been the cause for the people being scattered. And of course we know in history that was the cause. But if we didn't know that from history, we would just say that could be the cause of someone's dispersion. But they could have been dispersed because of just a crop failure. Crop failure, and so they all left their homeland to go somewhere else. Whereas whenever you get this term, when you get these two Hebrew terms, they're stronger terms. They're more harsh, galut and golah. This wasn't crop failure. This was military conquest of the land of Palestine. Now, let me pause and say, put this in parentheses here. This is going to be a very elaborately constructed study for the next 30 weeks now. And so what I'm saying, because I'm winding down right now, is going to tie into what we're going to start discussing next week. So that won't always be real apparent to you. It is to me, and that's all that counts, after all. No, not really. It should matter to you. That's why I'm here teaching you. I'm not here teaching myself. I'm here teaching you. But you'll have to kind of look back on these things and think about this, because I've got this rather like a spider's web, rather elaborately sewn together. But do you see what I'm saying here? I mean, there's no misunderstanding about that. The Greek term, let's start in chronological order. The Hebrew term, when Moses starts predicting that you're going to be dispersed, he might mention dispersed. But it's not just dispersed, as though we don't know what calls it. It's deportation. It's exile. It's a leading away by your military conquerors. And so whenever the Jews in Alexandria, Egypt, come on the scene, the 2nd century B.C., and translate the Hebrew Old Testament, and they go back sometimes to these two Hebrew words, galut and golah, they don't give us a harsh Greek term. They don't tell us anything about military conquest or victory. They give us this relatively easy or soft term, diaspora. So the question still is, why the relatively easy Greek term? Or maybe better phrased, how may we explain this? Well, I think in two ways. Both time and Hellenistic culture, and I would put the emphasis on the first of those, has a way of erasing and softening the impact of your past history. Doesn't time have a way of erasing old wounds and memories of bad events in your early life? Well, certainly it does. Time has a way of erasing those things. Now, that might not be the best in this case for time to have erased that, but nonetheless, that's the case. And, of course, I think also Hellenistic culture. Now, here's where the debate would begin. How much Hellenistic culture did these Jewish people in Alexandria really have? Well, that will be a discussion we'll get into later, but to some degree they had to have been influenced by Hellenistic philosophy. So time and Hellenistic culture had a way of erasing and softening the impact of military conquest and forced removal from their promised homeland. It had a way of erasing or softening the impact of military conquest and forced removal from their promised homeland. Therefore, they saw it appropriate to soften the rather harsh Hebrew terms of galut and golah, which speak of military conquest, to diaspora, which could be taken as kind of a providential word, as kind of we got scattered. We're not going to discuss under the use of this term what caused it, but just kind of we got scattered back in our history. If you use the Hebrew term, you know what scattered you. You disobeyed God. He sent foreign invaders in. They conquered you and took you out of the land. But Jews several centuries from them, time has softened that. Now they've been living in Egypt for, many, many years now. Now it's not so harsh. It's not such a harsh reality as it was earlier. And so you have another term. It's a new language, of course, but you have another term that's more appropriate because both your circumstances in a Hellenistic environment as well as the time lapse between when this event took place, the exile, and when you are now writing or when you are now thinking has tended to soften the impact of all of that. Some of the people actually began to grow proud of their prosperous cosmopolitan experience. They could think, those are backward Jews who live back up in Palestine. They haven't seen the real world. That's God's spiritual country. That's Zion City up there. They haven't seen the real world like we have been able to experience down here in prosperous, flourishing Alexandria. So some of the people actually began to grow proud of their prosperous cosmopolitan experience, and because of that, they'd want to soften the term, because it'd be rather a contradiction to be proud of your cosmopolitan experience, which was caused by your forefathers' disobedience, which resulted in military conquest and forced removal from their promised homeland. And we'll take note of this notion several more times in our study of how some of the people are rather proud of their far-flung, worldwide, Renaissance man type experience they have compared to the rather backward hillbilly Jews who still live in the promised homeland. And see, you can draw inferences from that into your own life and and to the experience of the church as well. Okay, another point of reflection. That was the most important one. That's probably the most important thing I wanted to say tonight, was to show you how these two different terms from two different languages mean different things. And what the Jews did, that little subtle way, it shows you someone slipping in their spirituality. To be able to look back on it, they should be calling that a forced exile, forced removal. We disobeyed God. They don't call it that. It's just kind of a gray, kind of blah dispersion. We just were scattered. And you're not told in that term what caused the scattering or the dispersion. The two apocryphal references are actually better than many of those biblical ones, in that the English we have has a more specific reference to the diaspora, much more so than, say, Daniel 12:2. Now, Deuteronomy 34 is very specific, but we had about half and half, or maybe it's more like 60-40, or maybe even more like 70-30. We had most of those references in our Bible anyway, didn't have anything to say or to do with the dispersion. The canonical scriptures, those first 10 references I gave you. But the two apocryphal ones in Judith and 2nd Maccabees are better than many of the biblical ones. Better in the LXX as a place where diaspora should be used. Another point of reflection, there are many other places in the LXX or in the Hebrew Old Testament itself which refer to this experience without the use of the term. So remember that. We're not talking about there were only 12 places in the Old Testament where God spoke of the exile or the dispersion. There are many places, I just said earlier in this message, hundreds of places in both the LXX and the Hebrew Old Testament where the prophets do refer to the experience. And the experience, specifically, I mean the Babylonian captivity. The prophets do refer to the experience without the use of either the technical term diaspora for the LXX, it'd have to be written in Greek, or the two Hebrew terms, galuth or golah. You wouldn't have to have any three of those terms, and you could still have a very specific reference to the Babylonian captivity and the scattering of the Jewish people from their promised homeland. I think you could call to mind yourself, maybe without thinking of a specific verse, just how many times have you read in Isaiah or in Jeremiah or Ezekiel or the prophets, just scores of places that you've read on your own in the Old Testament, where the prophets promise either a scattering of the people or a restoration of the people. And you have to have a dispersion before you could have a restoration. So he wouldn't even have to give you the dispersion. If he gave you a promise of God gathering again the Jews, well, you know gathering comes after dispersion. So you could have one reference that would actually refer to two things in. Whereas if you have a dispersion reference, that only necessarily refers to one. Dispersion, you don't have any promise you'll be gathered back. But a gathering of the people back to Israel also implies a scattering of them from Israel to begin with. So some diaspora has to be in view. And then finally here for our reflections of this technical term. The word can refer to A, B, and C. The word can refer to A, the people who are scattered. Just showing you how the word can be used, so you don't think I might be using it out of context. You can speak of them as the diaspora Jews, almost like an adjective. The diaspora Jews versus the Palestinian Jews. The Palestinian Jews live in Palestine. The diaspora Jews are part of the diaspora. So the term diaspora can actually refer to the people who are scattered. B, it can refer to the place, parenthesis S, places, to which they are scattered. It can refer to the places to which they are scattered. You'll often hear it used like this. So we'd speak of the various lands of the dispersion, the various countries of the dispersion. So these are diaspora countries. Again, it's almost like the use of an adjective, a diaspora country. A country into which Jews came as exiles from Palestine. And then C, and this is most of the time how it's used, is the actual state of the scattering. The actual state of the scattering. And that's generally how the word is used. The diaspora is just the diaspora, the scattering of the Jewish people. Doesn't refer to a certain type of Jew versus, a diaspora versus a Palestinian, or a certain place. Again, it could be a diaspora place versus Palestine. But the actual state, so it's a very broad, general use of the term, the state or the event of the scattering of the Jewish people. Now, there are the LXX places where the term is found. Here are the two appropriate Hebrew words that you would need to know. That covers the LXX, that covers the Hebrew Old Testament, that leaves us with the Greek New Testament. So in the last couple of moments, let's finish with the New Testament. Does the technical Greek term, diaspora, appear in the New Testament? Yes, it does. 3 times. In 3 very important places. One is in a class by itself, and then the second 2 go in a class together. Okay, let's start then with, do you know where these places are before I tell you where they are?
1 Peter.
Okay, 1 Peter's one. That's the last one. Pardon? Acts 1. For the term? No. We've got to find this term in the Greek New Testament. Other suggestions? Oh, you got reference to the dispersion in Acts. There's no doubt about that. Paul couldn't be doing all that traveling if there wasn't a dispersion of the Jews. But we want the term diaspora in the Greek New Testament. And then in the English we want something comparable like scattering or dispersion. Not familiar with the others, all right? Let's start with John chapter 7. This is in Christ's earthly life and ministry. John chapter 7, verse 35. This is the classic New Testament passage where it's found. And its basic meaning here is very obvious, just what we've given you. But this is the classic place. This is in a class by itself. The other 2 that I'll give you, Peter being one of those, James being the other are a little unusual. We're not going to get very far into an interpretation of them. That belongs more properly somewhere else. But John 7:35 is going to be using the term as we're familiar with the term, and as the term was technically used in circles of Judaism. Now, he's telling the Jews that, let's start in verse 33. I'm with you for only a short time, and then I go to the one who sent me. You will look for me. Here, John's going to use some of his humor and irony here. You will look for me. John's gospel is just filled with this. All right, I'll get through this sentence. You will look for me, but you will not find me. And where I am, you cannot come. Now, if you heard that from him, what would you think during that day? Well, you have to be a Jew to be able to think like these Jews think down in this next verse. He just said, I'm going to go somewhere, and you won't be able to follow me. And if you looked for me, you wouldn't be able to find me. Well, now, if he went to Galilee, they could probably search around and find him. Or he went down to the Dead Sea, they could look around and find him. And Palestine's only 100 miles by, 20 miles or something. There's a little tiny dot on the map. What if he goes out in the great dispersion of the Jews? How would you ever find him out there among those Gentiles? The Jews said to one another, where does this man intend to go that we cannot find him? Will he go where our people live, scattered among the Greeks, and teach the Greeks? What did he mean when he said, you will look for me, but you will not find me, and where I am, you cannot come? KJV. Then said the Jews among themselves, whither will he go, that we shall not find him? Will he go unto the dispersed among the Gentiles and teach the Gentiles? So you've got scattered in the NIV, and you've got dispersed. You'll always come back to one or the other of those 2 English words, and both are fine, scattered or dispersed. Now behind that, it's a technical Greek term in the New Testament, diaspora. That's the only time it appears anywhere in the New Testament in its classic, technical, specific usage. John 7:35. Okay, the other 2 places are James 1:1, 1 Peter 1:1. They're both found in the introduction to these 2 little epistles. So it's very easy to remember. James 1:1, and then we'll look at 1 Peter 1:1. And it's an unusual use of these two terms. These are the only two other places in the New Testament where the Greek term appears. It's not used precisely the same as it is in John 7:35, but it still obviously has the meaning of dispersion or scattering. Now, do you tell me what this means? James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. Classic introduction to James' epistle here that's well known. I'm sure you're familiar with this. To the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. Now that is to whom he is writing. We agree on that? That is to whom he's writing. All right, now my question is to you, to whom did James write? I mean, I know what he said there, but interpret that for me. Is he writing to the literal 12 tribes, Dan, Issachar, the members of the 12 tribes that were scattered after Babylonian captivity? And so these are non-Christian Jews. Is he trying to get them converted? Or is he writing to Christian Jews who are part of the 12 tribes scattered among the nations? Or has 12 just kind of become, well, in the New Testament, some people might argue, since there were 12 tribes of Israel, and there are 12 apostles in the New Testament, that 12 is kind of that number of completeness that refers to the whole Jewish economy, the 12 tribes, the whole Christian economy, the 12 apostles. So, cryptically, symbolically, allegorically, figuratively, whatever word you want to use, James is writing to all Christians throughout all of the world, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. Or could it be a combination of the three above that I've just given you? That's a thorny question. And you can't even get into James without knowing, well, maybe he'd even write to you. I mean, this is to whom it's addressed. And you've got to know, I don't see your name there. It says to the 12 tribes of the diaspora. Literally, just to the 12 tribes of the diaspora. And then NIV interprets that for scattered among the nations, which is what diaspora means. Well, while you're chewing on that, let's jump over to 1 Peter 1:1. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to God's elect, strangers in the world, scattered throughout, and he starts listing provinces of Asia. Diaspora, you find the same Greek term here. Well, that's a matter for either New Testament introduction or a study of those books proper. But in any case, the meaning is still dispersion or scattering. Whether it's a figurative, symbolical reference to Christians, whether it's a literal reference to Jewish people, whether it's a literal reference to Jewish Christian people, whether it's a combination of some of those, doesn't matter for us tonight. It might matter for you when you read the books, but it doesn't matter for us tonight with what we're studying. All we need to know is what's the meaning of diaspora. It still means I'm writing to some type of group of people who are scattered and dispersed. Now, whether it's the Jews scattered away from their homeland, then we've got a very technical usage, just like in John 7:35. If we're talking about Gentile Christians or a combination of some of the above, then it would be some type of figurative usage where he would be writing to Christians living far away from their true home, which is in heaven.